This recording is an overview of the readings for the 8th topic in our course on Introduction to Language Documentation and Description. In this overview, we're looking at readings relating to variationist sociolinguistics and sociolinguistics in general in the context of language documentation. Some of the main ideas are that linguistic variation should be a part of documenting and describing a language. Readings also touch on the value of documenting multilingualism rather than trying to document a single language. Looks at the value of statistical analysis of variation and the role that plays in describing and documenting languages, and also how attitudes towards variation in endangered languages affects the way we might document languages and help towards language maintenance projects. These are the readings that are included in this overview. The last two are the required readings for this course. This article from Childs, Good, and Mitchell is published in Language Documentation and Conservation. In this paper, the authors make a general appeal for the inclusion of more sociolinguistic data in language documentation projects. They point out that documenting a single language, or even more narrowly, documenting a single ancestral code, is often an inadequate record of linguistic diversity and fails to capture how language is actually used in a community. Instead, they advocate documenting multiple languages or dialects that are used in a speech community in a single documentation project. A project that includes multiple languages and dialects also requires additional sociolinguistic metadata. This metadata allows researchers to better understand which languages or which varieties are used in which contexts by which people for what reasons. This paper focuses heavily on multilingualism in Africa, as is the result of a workshop during the World Congress of African Languages held in 2012. More specifically, the authors call for 3 things to be included in language documentation projects. First, collecting linguistic data in a range of contexts, reflecting important social features of a community. Second, representation of the sociolinguistic configuration of the event which it documents. And third, collecting ancillary resources such as surveys of language use, metalinguistic interviews, ethnographic sketches, that will allow the data to be situated in the wider sociolinguistic context. And given the rationale for their appeal, the authors write, the primary reason for collecting sociolinguistic documentation is that it helps us get closer to the documentary promise of capturing a full record of the language practices of a community. In particular, it places more emphasis on situated language use than on specific, often idealized, pure lexicogrammatical codes. The other papers we're looking at in this overview focus more specifically on the subfield of sociolinguistics known as variationist sociolinguistics. And this handbook chapter by Bayley 2013 gives a summary of what variation sociolinguistics is. Variationist sociolinguistics begins with the work of William Labov, and for that reason is sometimes also called Labovian sociolinguistics. It is based on the premise that linguistic variation is not random, that there is always a reason for observed variation. Bayley gives a couple examples of variation in the analyses that have been done, looking at, for example, consonant cluster reduction in English, null pronoun variation in Spanish, whether or not subject pronouns are used. This field typically uses statistical methods to understand variation, and the motivations to explain the statistical patterns are often informed by ethnographic analysis. In summarizing what variationist sociolinguistics is, Bayley writes, the central ideas of variationist sociolinguistics are that an understanding of language requires an understanding of variable as well as categorical processes, and that the variation witnessed at all levels of language is not random. Rather, linguistic variation is characterized by orderly or, quote, structured heterogeneity. This paper by Mansfield and Stanford looks at some of the difficulties of applying variationist sociolinguistics in lesser studied communities. Mansfield and Stanford look at two case studies, one in China and one in Australia. They identify three challenges for applying variationist sociolinguistic methods in these contexts. The first is that the research is often a cultural outsider. This can make it difficult to identify the relevant social factors in the analysis. The second is that researchers are required to identify relevant linguistic variables with limited data and understanding of the language. The third is that statistical analysis are often required to have large amounts of data in order to be considered accurate, and in these contexts, data can often be very limited. The authors also suggest three possible responses to these challenges. One is to emphasize close collaboration with cultural insiders. Another is to ask speakers directly about observed variation, tapping into what they call folk linguistic knowledge. This may not give direct answers to questions about variation, but the responses can often be revealing in terms of what aspects of the society should be further investigated in order to understand the variation. The third is to focus on targeted elicitation in some contexts, which may be less natural but may help increase the numbers of tokens of particular variation that is the focus of an analysis. And to also emphasize that it's okay to report on patterns found in the data, even if there's not enough data available to show that those patterns are statistically significant. Meyerhoff 2019 also looks at the application of variation in sociolinguistics in the context of a language documentation project. This paper proposes that documenting sociolinguistic variation can play a key role in informing aspects of synchronic and diachronic grammatical analysis, and that, as such, linguists who are interested in these aspects of language should include variation in the documentation rather than filtering it out for the sake of making generalizations. Two case studies are considered in order to make this point, one on variation in the form of pronouns in Bislama, the other on optional objects in Bislama and another language of Vanuatu, Tamambo. In both cases, it's a study of the frequency of each of the forms across the corpus that plays a key role in the grammatical analysis. The study of variation in Bislama also reveals some complexity in the grammar, namely a sensitivity to alienability and inalienability that might not be available on first sight. Including variationist approaches in language documentation is not only beneficial for grammatical studies, but it also expands the field of variationist studies beyond what has mostly been studies of monolingual urban societies. Meyerhoff writes, incorporating the details of language variation into the description of a lesser-known language can resolve debates over what the underlying structure of that language is, and it can make a substantial contribution to debates about the typology of contact languages. The last paper in the readings is on language shift and linguistic insecurity. This paper is about attitudes towards language variation in the context of language shift or language endangerment. The main point is that minoritization of a language can lead to negative views of variation. This is the idea that there is a pure or true way of speaking a particular language. This can have the effect of making speakers of less prestigious varieties, and especially semi-speakers of the language, hesitant to use the language. Thus, ironically, valuing one particular version of a language can lead to less people being willing to speak the language and can accelerate or reinforce the trend towards language shift. Revitalization efforts, which place a high value on one particular variety of the language, can also unintentionally reinforce these attitudes. On a more optimistic front, the authors point out a case study in which directly addressing language attitudes or language insecurity seemed to have a positive effect on people's willingness to speak a language, even if they were speaking a less prestigious variety. Right. We see that documenting variation and explicitly addressing speakers' perception of variation in endangered language communities is a necessary part of documentation and revitalization efforts. Including documentation of the variants that are used by young people in the speech community, for instance, is one way of validating those varieties. One of the most effective strategies may simply be explicit discussion about variation and linguistic insecurity among speakers, among learners, and between both groups. If you're interested in following up on these topics further, here's a few resources to get started. One is the collection of articles under the title Documenting Variation in Endangered Languages that two of the readings we looked at are from this 2017 collection in Language Documentation and Conservation. Another is a book, an edited volume called Variation in Indigenous Minority Languages. And to get a closer look at sociolinguistics more generally, Meyerhoff's textbook Introducing Sociolinguistics is a good place to begin.